Hello, everyone. Okay, set to get started and continue the thread that's prominent today, and that is looking at how we can use the richness of early warning signals, conflict early warning, to inform preemptive action, early reaction, and set up the governance and decision-making rules to allow better use of predictive information and mitigate the impact of conflict-driven crises. I'll set the scene briefly. So for this panel, we want to adopt the approach or the definition prominently used in the humanitarian sector when it comes to anticipatory action. The most broadly accepted definition defines anticipatory action as interventions taken with the aim of preventing and reducing the impacts on lives, livelihoods, and humanitarian needs of predictable crises before the needs fully unfold. Anticipatory action works best if the system, the architecture around it is pre-established, pre-agreed before a crisis hits, before a forecast and an early warning signals that an imminent risk or threat is on the horizon. It builds around three system components. One is triggers, risk thresholds set on credible forecast information and predictive analytics. But then also pre-agreed actions designed in a way as to mitigate the expected impact of the hazard we're trying to address and taken ahead of the peak impact of that predictable shock. But a key element is also the pre-allocation of finance attached to that system. So making sure that once early warning signals detect a risk on the horizon, funding is automatically dispersed, implementing agencies, local authorities, and community stakeholders can implement action on the ground and are not restricted by lack of financing or reactive emergency appeal cycles. Humanitarian anticipatory action has grown from a niche approach that came about around a decade ago in the humanitarian sector to really a more broadly accepted approach to managing disaster risk. So currently we have, at the end of last year, based on the latest global overview report by the Anticipation Hub, 262 active anticipatory action systems and frameworks, covering a total of 14.9 people across 75 countries. And we have over 290 million in pre-agreed financing attached to these systems. So ready in place, ready to be dispersed when early warning signals and triggers are reached. As you see on the map, the scale has expanded quite significantly, but the overwhelming majority of these systems remain designed for hydrometeorological hazards. So anticipatory action systems for floods, droughts, and severe tropical storms, cyclones, and typhoons alone make up 80% of active frameworks and plans, with the remaining 20% largely focusing on health risks, disease outbreaks, and so forth. Conflict is a small fraction currently in the anticipatory action space. So understanding the richness of early warning data, forecasting tools for conflict-driven crises that we have, that you all have, represent essentially, this asymmetry is increasingly hard to defend. So looking at the case of forced displacement, it was mentioned in the opening panel this morning as well, conflict and violence remain the key driver of forced displacement globally. Based on DRC's latest global forecast report, at the end of 2025, we looked at 113 million people forcibly displaced globally. We're expecting that to rise by around 4.2 million by the end of 2027, so it's an upward trend. Again, driver is conflict. We have enhanced predictive intelligence. Why don't we use that to inform earlier action and mitigate conflict during crises? And setting this panel discussion also in the current moment we're finding ourselves in. Obviously, all components of the humanitarian development peace nexus are under unprecedented strain currently. We have humanitarian funding overstretched, but similar trends we see in the peace sector and development investments as well. So there is a need for new approaches of how we use financing, how we use all the predictive intelligence we collectively hold to mitigate crises before they escalate into large-scale emergencies. So that is a bit the scene we're finding us in. And with that, I welcome my panel to the stage. And I'll start with John. welcome to the stage. So John is the executive director and founder of the Youth and Social Advocacy Team. It's a refugee-led organization that works with youth along the South Sudan, Uganda displacement axis. So it tries to provide anticipated support to at-risk communities and youth forcibly displaced due to conflict. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Then I'm welcoming Antje to the floor as well. So Antje is the fund manager of the Complex Risk Analytics Fund, where she works on pooled financing for AI and data. She previously worked for OCHA, managed pooled funds, including SURF and country-based pooled funds. So she's bringing a bit the financing dimension to the discussion today. Then Jerome needs no introduction, you just spoke, but representing a bit how conflict can feature in multi-hazard early warning and anticipatory action systems, taking Somalia as a complex risk landscape as an example. Then Marek from INZO, International NGO Safety Organization, an organization that aims to support NGOs when it comes to operational safety, humanitarian access. He's a research analyst supporting the organization with using conflict intelligence to inform NGO safety. And then last but not least, Morten from the Danish Refugee Council. He's the head of innovation data. Sorry. Head of innovation data and analysis. So he oversees DRC's growing portfolio of displacement forecasting tools, and also how these tools can be used to inform earlier action when it comes to displacement crises. So welcome, panel. We'll start off with a quick Ignite round. So I'll ask each of you a very short situation statement in which a signal was detected and it led to an action or non-action, and what impact that had. I'll start with Craft with a bit of an ecosystem bird's eye view. Over to you, Antje.
Thank you so much. And I would like to zoom out a bit, because Craft is not an operational organization, but rather we finance the data and analytics that everyone relies on in the humanitarian peace and security and development space. And I believe for conflict anticipatory action, the issue isn't the missing signal, it's rather the disconnected and the fragment signals, right? Because connected data shows both how conflict is evolving, how it is moving, and how it's impacting people, right? How it shapes displacement, protection risks, how it restricts access to health and education. And we heard a lot about that in the opening panel yesterday, right? So one data set alone isn't enough, right? Conflict data needs to be connected to be powerful. And to act early, we need to connect the dots. We need to see how conflict is evolving, how it is moving, and how it is impacting people on the ground. So crisis data today shapes around $30 billion in crisis assistance, including increasingly through anticipatory action, right? Around $300 million lined up for pre-arranged financing. Most of that goes towards climate hazard, only a small fraction for conflict. So the ecosystem behind, or the data ecosystem behind that is really vital. And we at Craft tend to think of it as a navigation system that steers those billions of dollars in crisis assistance. Also, it's true that today we have more data than ever, and we have built many models, many analyses, many platforms on top of that. But there's one challenge that remains in the core layer that feeds all those tools, and that is that it's fragmented and siloed. We ran a survey with over 100 organizations in that space last year, and it really pointed towards those issues, right? Fragmentation, duplication, there's a lack of standard, a lack of coordination, and there's also a problem with data quality. The Center for Humanitarian Data found that last year only 75% of the crisis data in the major humanitarian contexts are up to date and timely. So there's really a problem there. And I'll finish it with what we are doing in Craft to strengthen that navigation system. And it's really about not directly investing in anticipatory action, but really strengthening the underlying foundation that is needed to act earlier, faster, and more targeted, including through anticipatory action.
Thanks, Antje. All right, then jumping straight to the very localized level, asking John, your perspective on what warning to signal value chain actually means for communities at risk, how that translates on the ground. Over to you.
Thank you. It's refreshing to talk from a community perspective because there's been a lot of data. And I'm happy to say that. It would be safe to say that no one leaves their home unless there's someone chasing them, right? And also, most times, surprisingly, people don't leave because there's a dashboard somewhere that is telling them to leave or giving them any signal to leave. There are patterns that we follow. There are daily realities that we follow. And when we see them shifting or changing, that's when we start to act. And although the title says I'm director, I'm a displaced person, and in 2013 I was a victim of the same. And I feel this is a topic that is very close to my heart, because I was in school in Yei, very innocent, never affiliated to any political party. I left my home in Jonglei, almost middle of South Sudan, or up north, to the south, just to look for a school, a better school, to say that. And then we had, people were being arrested in Juba, there was fighting and all that. But someone says, we have to leave and go to Uganda. And I remember my uncle said, no, we cannot leave. The borders are still open. The traders are still moving. The army where the soldiers are is not yet blocked. They have not seen certain guns placed there. They have not seen some certain checkpoints. So things are still okay. I can bet none of that data was available anywhere in your headquarters, not even in our country, right? But that was available locally on our ground. We made sure that myself, my brother finished our exams. Luckily, 2 days to December 2013, just barely 2 days, they told us the commander has lost his control over the people. They have now blocked. Prayers are half, you have to do it. If you've been doing for 2 hours, now you have to do it only 30 minutes or 40 minutes, you leave. And then it's no longer safe. We have to go. And therefore, we had to pack. Then another sequence was we cannot go as a group. We must go in sequence. The first team leaves, and also you cannot use the traditional route that is Kaya border. There is another shortcut to use. All this information was being fed directly to us so that by the time we are moving, we reach to the Kaya border with Uganda safe. And that, in my opinion, is how the anticipatory action, the signal from our side as people, look like. Now, the flip side in Uganda is the opposite of the traditional humanitarian response. All of us will be waiting with our fancy communications. 200 people have arrived. 300 have arrived. Now there are 1,000. We are communicating, I think, to people who have resources so that they can help. We are communicating to DRC so that they can respond. But in that case, it's already too late because we have already arrived, right? We are already at the reception center. Some of the people already kidnapped on the way. Some who fell in the ambush are already not there. So in this case, I believe that the movement of troops, the prices hiking, the monitoring of the traders' behaviors, then the local knowledge, the use of local telephones are our sources. And when they shift, that means we start to act. So I feel, as someone local on the ground, we struggle a lot to analyze data. It even becomes fancy. And then you struggle to sell the same data that came from the people. That is what you call dissemination, right? You got it from us, you analyze it very well, but you struggle to give it back to the same people that give you. And by the time it reaches us, it's either we've moved 2, 3, 4 miles, or we're already in the settlement. And that would be my submission. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So very evidently, preemptive action, informal early warning signal detection is very much happening on the ground already, but there's no systemic way to essentially support that coping taking place already at a very localized level. Moving to Inzo, from your very operational mandate, how does warning to signal translate for you in your operations?
Yeah, thank you very much, Lena, and hello, everybody. I would like to start by saying that in our perspective, honestly, there is very little credible warning for new crises, right? And they may seem so in hindsight as sort of less of surprising acts than they actually were. But I mean, if we think back to the HTS offensive in Syria, STC offensive in southern Yemen, if we think even 13 October Gaza, very difficult stuff to predict, right? However, that's not very helpful for anticipatory action. So I would like to sort of reverse this, look at the opposite side, and look at a case in which the feared outcome was perceived as so inevitable that everyone was compelled to act. Just so that we can start teasing out some enabling conditions for anticipatory action. And that case would be the fall of Kabul in August 2021. So the way this played out is that as the US forces were withdrawing, there was quite a wide understanding among NGOs that it would take a lot of time before the IEA could take on Kabul. That it was a possibility, but it will take time. And even as the IEA was progressing and by IEA I mean the Taliban, of course, as the IEA was capturing more and more districts, this consensus was a bit more shaken, but still the dominant hypothesis was that the progress will stop at well-defended cities. And it was only after these well-defended cities fell, so Kandahar and Herat, that everyone finally agreed that Kabul was going to be next and they needed to do something about it. So either consciously decide to stay for the sake of humanitarian mandate or evacuate out of fear for their staff's safety. The problem is that the fall of Kandahar and of Herat happened about 3 days before the fall of Kabul, so the window to react was extremely small. So what are the key features of the situation? We are looking at the prediction of the trajectory of an ongoing crisis, not an onset of a new one. I think everyone in the room knows that this is particularly difficult, and it is on all sort of levels of analysis. We also had overwhelming evidence that that outcome could materialize, and that evidence being that Kabul was literally the last city standing, right? And it was difficult to imagine the IEA wouldn't really take Kabul eventually. But the problem indeed is that the window for reaction was simply extremely small. And so, yeah, I think as INSO, the best we can try is increase that window by sort of providing that tipping point evidence a bit earlier, but also to help NGOs think through various outcomes, some of which may materialize and therefore sort of focus on resilience. But yeah, my point stays that some of the key crises are the most difficult to predict.
Thanks so much. So yeah, tight time windows, calling for speed of action under operational environments that are highly complex, brought by INSO. Last but second last. Jerome, you've set the scene well with your lightning talk. How do you embed the warning to signal logic from a multi-risk, compounding risk angle that you deploy in SOMREP?
Great, thank you very much. I think for SOMREP, the signal to action challenge is basically not only about detecting risk. Signals often exist. And I think my colleague also has highlighted how signals locally, in indigenous knowledge, they exist. Even the science side of it, they exist as well. The harder question is whether those signals are trusted, and also they are locally interpreted, but at the same time also they are translated into timely action. And especially for Somalia, where there's a lot of overlap between drought, rainfall, conflict, displacement, and that for us is very key. One concrete example is the El Nino that we experienced, the flooding that we experienced in 2023. The signals were there; it was very clear. Obviously, the riverine villages were at risk, and there's a lot of information, a lot of signals that existed. And through the Sadal early warning, we had that information, and we had a discussion with the local authorities, the government authorities, but also different humanitarian actors. And it was very clear that we need to move from monitoring to actual preparedness of the flooding that was there. This obviously included dissemination of alerts, engagement with the different actors, resource prepositioning, and then using the information now to guide partners in terms of prioritizing where preparedness and also response. But what happened was mixed, in the sense that in locations where information went through the community authorities, the government, in those locations, that information was trusted and it was acted upon. And these are the locations that experienced better preventive measures or better coping when the shock struck, when the flood came. And this was very critical because in those locations where this process was not followed, it meant that those particular communities took time to take the necessary preparations and the necessary action to prevent the catastrophe. However, the response or the preparedness obviously did not always match the scale and the speed at which the risk, the hazard happened. And I think we definitely were overwhelmed. And that was one of the times when we had to question the prediction, because some of the locations that were not even anticipated to be affected were affected. But also that speaks to the constraints limitation in terms of response, but also how quickly can actors come in to support when such happens. So for SOMREP, I think for us, from warning to action value chain, it's not simply about data, then to dashboard, and then to decision. It is data, community validation, and local interpretation, as well as agreed triggers what action needs to be taken, but also at the same time, institutional coordination on how to make sure that preparedness and the resource and response to early action. So for us, the main lesson from SOMREP is that early warning only becomes protective when it is embedded in local systems, and that they have the authority on the ground, but also at the government level, and also you need the resources to act before the shock becomes a crisis. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Jerome. So even if early warning signals are in place, or early warning systems and action systems are in place, they might fail to produce impactful action because there is lack of local ownership, lack of trust in the early warning messaging, and hence failing to translate into earlier action. So embedding into local structures and co-designing these systems with local stakeholders emerging as a key lesson. Last but not least, Morten, DRC is both a data provider and data user, essentially, of conflict-induced displacement forecasts. What has been your learning as an organization, entering this space, building up this programming operational portfolio? What does the warning to action chain look like for you?
Yeah, thanks a lot, and happy to be here. Thanks for coming. If I may, I'd like to just go back to your opening remarks, John, because I think they were really good for setting the context, because I think you showed two things. You showed why anticipatory action for displacement is important, and you also showed why it's hard, right? Because your experience is exactly what we try to improve upon through anticipatory action for displacement in DRC, and through the partnerships that we're able to develop in response to that. And I think your outline of your journey shows why it's hard, right? Conflict and displacement dynamics are really, really volatile and evolving rapidly, and so it's a bit hard to predict and plan for it, yet that's exactly what we're trying to do, right? So I think it's just a good scene setter. And maybe just for a bit more context, we started looking at predictive modeling of displacement crisis, I think about 7 years ago, maybe 8, through a partnership with IOM, and we developed this foresight model that worked at national level in a limited number of countries. And we tried to refine that a bit over time, and of course, through the years, the questions came up, well, this is all well and good, right? I think I heard a lot of people say that. Great data, right? What are we going to do with it? And that, of course, has a pathway to anticipatory action. And so we began to look at that, I think, 3-4 years ago. And the ambition really is to do, in a sense, what I think many of the speakers have outlined, including many of you here in the panel, is to narrow that gap, I think, between the signals and us responding in a way that either prevents escalation or mitigates the impact when it happens. And so I think, in a way, our value chain is pretty much what everyone's value chain are in this space. I think you also lined it out well in your opening slide there. I think where we try to further develop our models is in that interaction between the global displacement forecast or the national displacement forecast, which we continue to try to refine to more granular levels at the national dimensions, because the more granular you can get, the easier it is to use it for response planning and for activation. But it is complemented by, or even, how can you say, side-ordered with a community-level data component that speaks exactly to what you lined out as well, John. One thing is what the dashboard says, and another is how we can use community intelligence and combine the two, right? And so in our activation models, those two data sets combine, right? Both of them can trigger an activation. So I think that's one way of explaining it. I think the closest we've been to this, right, to take the signal and to do something with it, is a case that's also referred to in our global displacement forecast report that came out only a couple of months ago. One of the first pilots we did on anticipatory action for displacement was in South Sudan, in Akobo County, where we applied this model. And based on the signals it provided, we worked with local peace committees to try to de-escalate the situation. And in that particular narrow instance, it seemed to work, right? So displacement was lower than what we would have anticipated otherwise. And if we try to project sort of both the sort of human and financial cost of displacement, it seemed to be worth the while, right? So I think that's where we are today, is to try to build on that trajectory of predictive modeling, coupling it with those great examples of how you narrow that value chain, and then hopefully have more of those examples in the future.
Great, thanks, Martin. I think interesting organizational journey, starting from the data angle, arriving at a point of realizing, oh, we're actually able to predict conflict-driven displacement to quite a satisfactory degree of certainty and accuracy. So what do we do with that data, right? Having an operational footprint, making use of that data for earlier assistance ahead of displacement crises. So jumping back to John, you already outlined how informal warning to action looks like at community level. You brought a very personal story to that. How could community level coping be further enabled, further empowered with the support of more systemic structure around early warning and anticipatory action? What type of assistance and support could partners of the sector provide to make sure that positive coping is further enabled?
Yeah, thank you. I would term that as a twofold question, maybe. From our work in South Sudan, because we work at the intersection of displacement internally in South Sudan, but also across in Uganda. And there are two levels. When these signals, the one I just mentioned before, happens, the first phase is that children, elderly, cattle, are moved fast. So let's say it's the internal displacement. So then they know where to take their cattle so that they're safe, where to take the children, where to take the elderly, and then the women, and then the men remains behind for some reason. That's the first phase. And when that happens, the second group that decides to cross over, in this case at the corridor of Uganda, let's say the border areas of Morobo, Juba, Magui, all the bordering counties, they will send the first group, the elderly, the children, the women, across the border. So in these two scenarios, there are two things that we can help to do. First, from the community side, is that there are a lot of established informal community groups. They're either WhatsApp platforms, they're either their meeting points, they're either their trusted stakeholders within the community. So this layer has the responsibility to share accurate information to the partners, to the right stakeholders, so that validation can happen, so that support routes can be mapped properly and followed, and so that the right targeting, even when we want to respond, can be confirmed. Because we can say there are only men, children, and elderly are coming, but then men are there. So then that needs to be validated by someone there. Now, on our side as partners, one thing we can do is to trust the community data. One of the disconnect why anticipatory action, even from those who are experts in climate in this room, why it doesn't work, is that after getting the information, we say we're going to validate from the people who gave the information. So maybe change of language to see the communities as a stakeholder, to validate, not just validate the information, but use it. When we're getting responders, probably we get community members to respond. I know it's very critical to get external experts, very important, but once we see one of us using our own data to respond and support us, you will see that I've repeated us 3 times. That is the trust I mean. But if it's DRC data, it's validated by DRC, it's a DRC response, then believe it or not, we will receive the support we get, and we forget it. YSAT, let me not use DRC, I would say YSAT. They would still say, oh, they are our refugee-led organization, but they've abandoned us. You know, they're no longer using us, they're using their knowledge. So that trust, if it can be that close, I think for me, and promoted, that will also be good. Then passing of the information. I want to believe that once data is collected and we have it, how we pass it to the people, if we could use the local language, if we can use the informal systems that they understand better, it makes sense, because sometimes we have very good data, but then it lands, and then it gets twisted before they act on it. It either becomes a misinformation. I know recently in Ayot, we had a scenario where communities were informed to come and receive assistance, but not in that location that was intended. But someone from the government got it and used it to inform people to come to the county headquarters just because they want to show the population. So I also feel like how we pass that information matters a lot. Now, on the support, I appreciate a lot. There's great work, IOM here, UNDP, someone from World Vision, my colleagues in DRC. I feel the support we give once people arrive at the final destination is too late. By that time, we will be glorifying how many people were exposed to rape, you know, very unfortunate. We will be talking about how many people that were exposed to certain deaths, for example. We'll be talking about, you know, how many lives we've lost. So what we feel we could do, the DRC, YSAT, and the team, is that we could pre-position life-saving support along the routes. That, for me, would be a game changer, because people that do not want to cross over are not deprived of the support they need before they change their status. You don't have to help me because I've crossed a border to become a refugee. If you can help me because I'm already displaced in my own house, that for me would give anticipatory action a valid point in the humanitarian space, in my opinion. So those would be my, my thoughts. And of course, when people cross over, which is what the team at DRC from the Uganda side have been doing very well, is that we will receive a less crisis in a way, because some people would have received great information that make them decide whether to really cross or just find safety and then move back in a few times. That will reduce the number. if they ever cross, they will find us prepared to respond. So those would be my opinions. Thank you.
So seeing communities as central stakeholders in the design process of warning systems, early warning systems, and anticipatory action systems, involved from the start, trusting community data and insights, and also providing anticipated assistance along displacement routes and not focusing solely on arrival sites when needs have escalated already. Moving to Somalia, SOMREP, again, multi-hazard, cascading risk landscape, working with such a diverse consortium of stakeholders. Where do you see the biggest friction points in the value chain currently? Is it moving from data to credible early warning, bringing the early warning messaging to at-risk people, or translating the warning into action? Where along those steps do you see the biggest challenges?
Thank you very much. For SOMREP, the biggest friction is not necessarily in the data to warning. We have the systems that are there. The system is able to consolidate the different risk information, and then from risk information to what that risk information means, and that is translated to the local authorities, to the different institutions and ministries and implementing partners. But the bigger friction is mostly from the warning, the decision, and then the action. So within these three, this is where the system is tested. And it's tested because a warning does not automatically mean that that's an action. But also, a decision does not necessarily mean that translates to action. What that means is that, I think as a system, it should provide that opportunity to understand the different overlapping risks that exist within Somalia. We have different actors with different mandates, and when a signal comes, it is interpreted based on the mandate, the risk tolerance, but also the operational capacity that exists within that institution. So one of the key things that I think comes to us as SOMREP, it's also on some of the things that determine the early action, issues of access, being constrained. Even you can have the resources, but you're not able to access some of the areas that have been affected. And that obviously affects the early action that needs to be taken. For us, the question is not necessarily, it's not only whether the signal is accurate, but also it's about who trusts that signal. And with that trust, then who has the authority now to act on it, and who had the resources to move. And with the resources, also it's about the accountability to the decisions that have been made. And this is where SOMREP's resilience approach comes in to address that gap. This is the case because through SOMREP resilience approach, there are systems that are set up. We have early warning committees. We have interventions of using different community governance structures. And all these are there as predetermined structures that we need to work with in case of a signal, and the understanding through these structures what that signal means and what action needs to be taken. And that also helps in part of the resilience programming is to prepare and have finances available in case of a risk or in case of a crisis. And in that case, when we're doing resilience programming, there is that available financing in case of such kind of crisis, and we call it crisis modifier. And that helps to quickly translate signals, warnings, and to action by now activating those particular resources that now will be able to address the immediate needs before the other resources that comes with response come now to address the impact of that particular crisis. So for us, from SOMREP, it's about the long-term resilience investments in the delivery infrastructure, and like the short-term early action. So when all these, the trigger or the triggers reach, the signal is there, the question is not necessarily what new mechanism we need to create, but what existing community structures, government systems, partner capacities, and resilience investments can we quickly activate. So from our end, in terms of the signal to action, the lessons for us is that anticipatory action becomes more effective when it is embedded in the long-term existing resilient systems. But also, we understand, for example, our system, SADAL, is able to provide the signal. But the value of that comes when that signal is now embedded or linked to pre-agreed thresholds. But at the same time, also clear decision protocols and also flexible financing and then the actors who are already in place, who are already present before the shock strikes.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jerome. So pointing to the value of having all these systems components pre-agreed, set up before triggers are hit and early warning signals detect imminent crises, so that no time is lost in ad hoc decision-making, unclear governance structures. And your experience from doing that with diverse set of stakeholders with different mandates. Morten, DRC adopts essentially a similar approach, pre-agreeing systems, anticipatory action plans, using displacement forecasts for preemptive action. What have been your learnings in scaling this, and what are the biggest gaps you see remaining in turning this to something scaled and mainstreamed?
Yeah, thanks for that question. There's a lot, right? And it's still early days in a way, so there will be more. I think if I can pull out a couple of factors that I think influence also how we think about things going forward. I think one is the context piece that we also started with, right? When we talk about conflict-related displacement and linked anticipatory action, it's very context-driven, right? So we may have sort of some standardization at the model or the general approach, but when it translates down to each country, we need to look at it again and tailor it to each context. So there's a bit of retrofitting and a bit of dialogue between what happens at each country level and how we think about the global models. I think that's one where also maybe there's a bit more context than when you look at climate-related models, for example, which is a bit easier, I think, to some degree to standardize, not disregarding that there's contextual issues in that as well. I think Jerome, just now you pointed to an important piece here that these models are not standalone, right? And these approaches are not standalone. The more they sort of attach themselves to existing infrastructure, the higher the chances of success are. And I think that goes just as much for the work that we do as for some of the work that's been going on in the more sort of climate and resilience focused space. The example I gave before around local peace committees, for example, you don't establish those when you have a trigger, right? Then it's too late. So there's a lot of work, I think, that is about matching with what already there and then building that sort of minimum capacity to be able to activate it, I think, once the crisis hit. I think one of the things that we've been discussing lately is also organizational readiness. So maybe before was more about systems readiness in a way. I think also in an organization like ours that's been running for 70 years, I think was in the intro slide there. Of course, there's a bit of muscle memory on how we do things, and some of it, for example, around the sort of emergency response side or normal ways of responding, are maybe not directly tailored to what you would need in a sort of anticipatory action setting. Maybe the sort of responses should be slightly differently tailored, et cetera, et cetera. So those are some of the things that I would pull out. I could probably highlight a few more, but I also noticed we're a bit late on time, so back to you later.
Perfect, thanks. One key element, Antje, looking at you, is the financing. As presented in the opening, the vast majority of anticipatory finance, fuel funding to finance the implementation of anticipatory actions ahead of predictable hazards goes to climate shocks, hydrometeorological hazards. How can that asymmetry, that imbalance be addressed, and what are kind of the root causes you think that the financing is so unevenly allocated? How can more financing be pre-positioned to anticipate conflict-driven crises as well?
That's a very good question. I can't necessarily speak to sort of pre-positioning financing for anticipatory action. I think I can speak more to, okay, like triggers, risk tolerance, and sort of the decision framework. Because like through CRAFT, we invest in the underlying data. And if we look, for example, on trigger design, and I spoke to that, you know, like conflict prediction, conflict impact really relies on connecting data from several domains. And I think John and Jerome spoke so wonderfully to the fact that there also needs to be a connective tissue between sort of, or like the involvement of the local communities in trigger design and trigger implementation. So that's really a key point, and I think that can be a barrier. I think a barrier is also perhaps the risk tolerance. Conflict can be very sensitive, and I think also there's a higher uncertainty, right? So acting earlier can feel risky, but at the same time, you know, the long-term costs can be much higher. So it's very important to have a sort of a certain risk tolerance for acting early. I think sort of the real bottleneck is perhaps around sort of the decision-making authority architecture. And again, this also goes back to what John and Jerome alluded to, right? So of course we need, you know, connected and trusted evidence, but more so we do need agreed decisions and rules that are embedded with the local communities, right? Otherwise, signals are being missed, signals go out in the dark and no one is acting on it. We need a clear authority to act on signals and thresholds, and that's the point. That's the point you are referring to. We also need the financing lined up. So if risks reach a certain threshold, the financing needs to be lined up in order for the community to act on it. So if these three things come together, I think then it can work out.
Great. And then last, Inzo, risk of action versus inaction, risk of acting based on a false alarm, risk of not acting and having a false hit that wasn't addressed and acted on, missed hit, sorry. How does that translate into your operational mandate, essentially? How do your partner organizations weigh that difficult decision, and how is early warning information factored into that?
Yeah, so there is obviously a fundamental difference between early action in what we do, right? Because the risk of inaction is usually so much higher than overreacting compared to programming, where the risks of opportunity cost, for instance, will be much higher, right? But so the question is, what can actually anticipatory action on staff safety and security and access tell us about NGO readiness to act on early warning for programming? And long story short, this will bring me back to the pre-agreed systems, the decision-making frameworks. But I would like to start with a brief professional anecdote. About 3 years ago, I was working with a partner organization on their contingency plan for Goma, the DRC, and we agreed that the trigger would be that the M23 approaches Sake city, so about 20-30 kilometers west of Goma. That materialized in a few months, but the immediate reflex wasn't really to trigger the contingency plan. It was really to check what everybody else was doing and whether we needed to recalibrate that contingency plan, right? And we can agree or not on whether this was a good trigger, but ultimately my point is that the reflex to check what everybody else is doing is quite a prevalent one in the sector. And once this collective understanding of the situation is established, it's quite sticky and it's difficult to counter it with any kind of evidence. And in this context, I mean, we established the CHDC, the conflict event database that we run, precisely on the premise that NGOs sort of decision-making around security risks was lacking evidence, and the database is used in times of stability or a relative stability, you know, for that data-informed intuitive analysis that that NGOs would generally be able to do, but in terms of crisis, or when the crisis is imminent, we're usually asked questions such as, what's the temperature, right? What are the atmospherics? What's going on the ground? And I think that really illustrates the reflex to go back to intuition with its both benefits, such as fast decision-making, as well as pitfalls, including a degree of groupthink, perhaps. And so I think this is really the common denominator for anticipatory action across several domains, because, you know, in our sector, NGOs will be asking themselves, do I really want to be the first one to leave the city? And I suppose, and you tell me, but I will think that in anticipatory action for programming, you'd be asking yourselves, why is it that my model alone is showing that a certain area needs some kind of anticipatory action? Is my model off, right? And so, to answer your question, whether the risk calculus is skewed, I suppose to some extent it is, but it isn't in a uniform way. It is also not necessarily because of operational constraints alone. It is also because of this collective understanding of the situation. And just to finish this entry off, this is obviously an oversimplification to some extent, right? But there is, of course, diversity in response. But my point really is to just say that the question of, what everybody else is doing is driving our decision-making on anticipatory action a little bit more than we'd like to admit sometimes.
Thanks. All right. Questions from the floor? Please go ahead, yeah.
Hi. It's occurred to me as I've been listening to people talk that we, of course, speak about early warning quite a bit, rightfully so, but depending on the time scale that we're looking at, sometimes maybe we'd be better to speak of late warning or even going beyond that, something that's not warning at all anymore, but really something my organization is interested in, which is enhancing people's situational awareness during an ongoing crisis so they have a better chance of safely navigating that dangerous situation. That particularly came to mind, John, as you were speaking about your own experience moving from South Sudan to safety in Uganda. So I don't really, to be honest, have a very specific question about that, but I'd like to get people's thoughts on the timelines that we're working with here when we talk about early warning and how we draw a threshold between early warning, which could mean years up to, I don't know what, does days ahead of a crisis still count as early warning? Or does that become then late warning, and then what comes after that once a crisis is unfolding? So it's not for anyone in particular, but I'd like to hear thoughts on that.
Thank you. I think we'll take 3 in a cluster. Yeah.
As we use predictive models to start anticipating mobility decisions, how do we ensure that we're not embedding Western rational actor logics into their design? And how do we start accounting for duties of care to the land or to herds or things beyond the self that look different across sociocultural contexts in this agentic modeling?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for this panel and for all of your insights. I have a question, I guess, for anyone who would like to take it specifically on Syria, because I agree with what Marek said, that the HTS offensive in December 2024 maybe wasn't predicted, but since they've come to power in Damascus, there's been a series of repeated targeting of various ethnic and religious minorities, Alawites, Druze, Kurds, and the problem here, in my view, is not that this is sort of like siloed or hidden in different data sets, but it's happening, wide open in the public, and anybody who's paying attention is aware of this. My sense is that, and I would like to be proven wrong, that there's this sort of group think that President Trump has said he wants to give al-Sharaa a chance at greatness. Europe wants to send the refugees back. And so as long as it's not as bad as what the Assad regime has done, we're just not going to do anything. But there is sort of this pattern of repeated offensives against minorities that have all led to mass displacement. And so what would you suggest doing in a situation like this where, or do you have examples from your experience in other countries where perhaps a shift could be brought about in preventing what will likely be another round of targeting and offensives against minorities in perhaps the coming year? Thank you.
Thanks so much. Another one? No. Okay. Shall we take these first questions? So timescales. I think that goes to those actually actively using early warning data currently, and that is DRC, SumRep, and John, maybe you can speak to kind of these community level early warning signals. I mean, more or less how much lead time they give for action, what you've seen. Yeah. Over to you guys. DRC?
I can go first. Well, thanks for all of those three questions. Those would be fascinating discussions to unpack a bit, if we could have an hour more, maybe, actually. Do you want to take them one by one, or do you want to
yeah, just go into all of them.
Fire,
as you want, yeah.
I think on the timeliness, I think it's a good point, and I think it's even more enforced by the fact that we're not looking at sort of things in isolation, right? All of this is one big mix of events, right? And so what is early warning in one case versus what is late warning, and from our side as an emergency responder, also with our local partners, we debate actually, like, is this anticipatory action, or is this like an early emergency response? And sometimes we have to remind ourselves that people don't care, right? That we care, and we have different boxes and silos, but it doesn't really matter. It's about trying, I think, to narrow the gap between a signal of something bad about to happen and then positioning ourselves as a collective, how best to do something about it. And I think just more granularly, our model is 3 months, right? So it rolls every quarter, and then we use that as the basis to try and look at what could be done. But that's not the same as saying, well, in 3 months' time, this will happen. It's to say there's a likelihood of an event of this magnitude that will happen within that time frame, but then we also really need the community grounding to nuance that and enable us to respond. So I think that's on the timeliness side. Yeah.
Perfect. Any other takers of any other questions? We're running out of.
So let me just speak on the timeliness. So through the early warning system, we had clear available data on El Nino and which locations are going to be flooded. And that meant prepositioning resources in those particular locations and mapping out different infrastructures within that could obviously support when the flooding gets worse. One of the things that we observed when the actual flooding started happening, and which we now moved from this early warning system to the actual monitoring system, real data collection as in terms of the impact of the flooding, was that as we were getting the data on which locations we had predicted that they'll be affected, we noted that some of the locations that were not part of the prediction were heavily hit, meaning that the early warning system might have missed these particular locations. But what also that meant is that how can we quickly support these locations which we did not predict that they'll be affected. And that, in this case, because we had existing partners in those locations, that's when we were able now to use those particular the footprint of our partners to be able to support in those particular locations which were not predicted to be affected. I'm providing this example because of there's a warning, an early action that needs to be taken, but now the crisis has hit. What are we doing in the midst of that crisis to respond? And I think you rightly said that's the response side of things. And for us is making sure that we have existing systems that are able to predict before the crisis happens, but also existing systems that are able to help us in terms of decision support as the crisis is happening. And that, in this case, helps to ensure that there's that linkage throughout before the crisis, between as the crisis is happening, then even post-crisis.
Great.
Yeah.
John, quickly, and then...
I really like the question from Christopher about the anticipatory action, how we design it. And in my own opinion, with the work we are doing with DRC right now, is looking at anticipatory action plan that is no one size fit all. For instance, can we look at severity? There can be 100 people, but the risk is so high. Can we respond? Or should we not care because what my colleague just mentioned, it does not hit our threshold, so we can't, but the severity is high. Remember, the community build their trust on that. If you don't respond today, tomorrow you're looking for more households, they won't give you the data. So that could be one. The second could be the scale, which is what we're looking at. How many households are displaced? That also could be one. And the last could be just the normal or the information verification that I believe projects like Sentinel are already doing, providing the flip side of what you think is information correct or not correct. So those would be my recommendation if we want to have anticipatory action plan that can address those. And on the very nice question someone asked about whether the Western logic does not interfere with the design of the anticipatory action. I don't like speaking so hard on that because I'm from the other side, but now that you ask, I can't answer because that is what we've been struggling to do. You get the information, we tell you how to do it, but when you design it with your systems that are not responsive to ours. One, for instance, when it comes to implementation, who is implementing it? Is it the local staff on ground? Are we doing the international procurements, or is it the local procurements? How are we delivering it? Is it safe? Who is delivering it? When? And the last one, how do we measure impact? Is it participatory action research or M&E data? So if you will permit me say that, I would say we need a little twist so that our anticipatory action plan can be people-centered, people-driven, and locally led. Thank you.
Great. I think we're over time. Yeah, so this panel bringing together diverse perspective and approaches to what the warning to action chain actually means, how it can be constructed as a system, linking also with what was brought forward this morning in the opening panel, the UNDP speaker, calling for a systems approach to conflict early warning, early action, making sure that the different system components are pre-agreed, that decision rules exist, and that we have resources attached to predefined triggers and action plans that can be automatically dispersed when triggers are hit, so we don't lose time with resource mobilization in unclear governance structures. I think it was great to see what is emerging from the different actor or mandates on the panel here, ranging from the donor community, implementing stakeholders, community and local actors, and yeah, the international NGO community. The speaker from AI for Peace yesterday in the opening said that we have all the stakeholders in this room. I argue that yes, we do, but there's also room to further enhance linkages with other communities of practice. For me, that is the anticipatory action community of practice that has really driven forward the systemic approach for how anticipatory action functions, how pre-allocated financing functions, and happy to continue bridging that gap. Thank you.